History tells us about emperors, wars, dynasties, and glory. It tells us about silk roads, golden dragons, and the splendor of the Forbidden City. But it rarely tells us about the women who disappeared behind palace walls. Women whose laughter once echoed through marble halls before being swallowed by silence. What if the greatest empire on earth erased not just enemies, but its own secrets? What if power demanded not loyalty, but sacrifice? Tonight, we step beyond the official chronicles and into the hidden chambers of imperial China, where emperors ruled not only kingdoms, but the fate of thousands of concubines, whose stories were deliberately buried. In the heart of ancient Beijing stood the magnificent Forbidden City, a palace so vast it seemed like a city within a city. Its vermilion walls and golden roofs shimmered beneath the sun, symbolizing divine authority. To the outside world, it was the center of civilization during the Ming and Qing Dynasties. Inside, however, it was something far more complex, a gilded cage. The emperor was called the Son of Heaven. His word was law. His power was absolute. Yet beneath the layers of ritual and ceremony lay a hidden world that few dared to describe in writing. An imperial harem was not simply a collection of lovers. It was a political institution. At times, thousands of women lived within the palace walls, selected from noble families, regional elites, or even ordinary households. During the reign of the Wanli Emperor, records suggest hundreds of women resided in the inner court. Under the Kangxi Emperor, the harem system became even more structured, codified into strict ranks and titles. From empress to noble consort, from consort to lady, each woman's status determined everything. Her clothing, her servants, even the number of meals she was permitted. But entry into the palace was not a choice. Every few years, officials would conduct the beauty draft. Young women, often between 13 and 17, were inspected for health, appearance, family background, and obedience. Once selected, they would never return home. Families sometimes celebrated the honor. Others wept in silence. The records describe ceremony. They describe silk robes and etiquette manuals. What they do not describe is fear. Inside the palace, life was governed by rigid hierarchy. A single misstep could bring severe punishment. Official histories rarely mention the discipline imposed upon concubines. But palace memorials and later memoirs suggest harsh confinement, beatings, and lifelong isolation were common. And then there was the emperor's favor. In theory, the emperor's attention brought fortune. In reality, it could mean danger. Consider the case of Consort Xian during the reign of the Guangxu Emperor. Intelligent, outspoken, and supportive of reform, she earned the emperor's affection. But her influence angered powerful court figures, particularly Empress Dowager Cixi. When foreign armies approached Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion, Consort Xian was reportedly thrown into a well. Official documents were vague. The palace moved on. Her death was reduced to a footnote. How many others vanished without even a footnote? In earlier centuries, the fate of concubines could be even more brutal. During the early Ming Dynasty, a grim tradition existed. When an emperor died, some of his concubines were forced to follow him in death. Records indicate that the Hongwu Emperor ordered dozens of his concubines executed upon his death to accompany him. The official reason? Loyalty beyond the grave. The unofficial truth? Control beyond death. Confucian ideology emphasized hierarchy and obedience. A woman's virtue was defined by submission. Palace scholars wrote extensively about morality, but rarely about consent. Once inside, a concubine's body and future belonged to the emperor. Competition was constant. Bearing a son could elevate a woman to unimaginable power. Failing to do so could mean decades of obscurity. Poisonings were rumored. Alliances formed and shattered. Eunuchs castrated men who served the inner court acted as gatekeepers of information and influence. Some rose to immense power, such as the infamous Wei Jiangshan, who manipulated court politics. For concubines, survival required strategy. But even strategy offered no guarantees. In certain reigns, emperors grew paranoid. During periods of instability, concubines were sometimes accused of witchcraft or conspiracy. Under the young Zheng emperor, court discipline tightened dramatically. He enforced strict surveillance within the harem. Movements were tracked. Correspondence monitored. Isolation intensified. The palace was designed to prevent escape, not just physically, but psychologically. Walls separated the women from the outside world. Windows were screened. News filtered in slowly, if at all. A concubine could spend 50 years within the same courtyard without once stepping beyond the gates. When emperors lost interest, the women did not leave. They remained aging, forgotten, living as ceremonial figures. In rooms that grew quieter each year. And then came the erasure. Imperial historians were tasked with protecting the dignity of the throne. Scandals were softened. Brutality reframed as ritual. Deaths labeled as illness. The suffering of hundreds reduced to silence in official records. We know what we know because of fragments of private diaries, later testimonies, archaeological evidence, and rare confessions. Recorded by foreign visitors during the final decades of imperial rule. In 1912, when the last emperor Pui abdicated, the imperial system collapsed. The gates of the Forbidden City would eventually open to the public. Tourists would walk through its courtyards, marveling at the architecture. Few would realize they were walking through the echoes of lives that history chose not to remember. The truth is not that every emperor was monstrous. Some showed genuine affection. Some sought reform. But the system itself built on absolute authority and female confinement allowed suffering to flourish behind silk curtains. The concubines were not merely romantic figures in painted scrolls. They were political pawns, bargaining chips. They were teenagers forced into lifelong seclusion. They were mothers whose sons might become emperor or be executed. And they were disposable. When a dynasty fell, new rulers rewrote history. When scandals threatened legitimacy, ink erased them. The palace demanded loyalty, and loyalty demanded silence. What was erased was not only violence, but humanity. If the outer palace symbolized order, ritual, and divine harmony, the inner palace functioned like a perfectly engineered machine, cold, calculated, and relentless. To understand what was erased from history, we must first understand how the system truly worked. Inside the Forbidden City, the inner court was not chaos. It was bureaucracy. Every concubine was catalogued, every movement recorded, every meal documented. The emperor may have been called the son of heaven, but heaven itself operated through paperwork. By the height of the Qing dynasty, the harem system was regulated down to the smallest detail. Women were divided into strict ranks: empress, imperial noble consort, consort, concubine, and several lower titles. Each rank came with precise allowances: number of servants, quality of silk, access to certain courtyards, and even the style of phoenix embroidered on their robes. But rank was not permanent. Favor determined survival, and favor could change overnight. The selection process itself was a spectacle disguised as tradition. During the triennial selection, banners from across the empire sent eligible daughters to Beijing. Under emperors like the Kangxi Emperor and the Qianlong Emperor, the empire stretched across vast territories, and the banner system ensured that elite Manchu, Mongol, and selected Han families offered daughters for inspection. Girls lined up in silent rows, faces powdered lightly, eyes lowered. Officials examined their teeth, posture, skin, even the symmetry of their ears, believed to signify fortune. They were asked almost nothing. Their future was decided in minutes. Some were sent home immediately. Others were told they would serve in the palace as maids. The chosen few were elevated as imperial consorts. And once chosen, they ceased to belong to their families. They belonged to the throne. But belonging did not mean intimacy. Many concubines would never even meet the emperor. Contrary to romantic legend, the emperor's nights were scheduled. Eunuchs maintained meticulous records of which consort would be summoned and when. The emperor did not wander freely among the women. Ritual dictated the process. A concubine selected for the evening would be bathed, perfumed, wrapped in specific robes, and transported, sometimes literally carried in blankets to ensure purity, to the emperor's chamber. Afterward, her name, date, and details were logged. Why such precision? Succession. If a child was conceived, the court needed exact records. In an empire where legitimacy determined stability, paternity could never be questioned. Yet pregnancy was both blessing and threat. When a concubine became pregnant, her life changed instantly. She received better food, closer supervision, and sometimes protection. But she also attracted jealousy. History records the rise of powerful empresses who began as low-ranking consorts. Empress Dowager Cixi entered the palace as a relatively minor consort of the Shan Feng Emperor. When she gave birth to a son, the future Tongzi Emperor, her influence transformed dramatically. After the emperor's death, she maneuvered politically to become regent, effectively ruling China for nearly half a century. Her story is extraordinary, but it is also rare. For every Cixi, there were dozens who vanished. Miscarriages were common. Infant mortality was devastatingly high. Some historians believe that deliberate poisoning occurred in certain reigns, though official documents rarely admit such crimes. Instead, they use vague phrases like sudden illness or heavenly misfortune. Within the palace walls, rumors traveled faster than official edicts. Concubines formed alliances for protection. Senior consorts gathered loyal attendants. Eunuchs became critical intermediaries, capable of delivering messages or withholding them. The wrong whisper in the wrong ear could destroy a woman's life. The most terrifying fate was not death, it was obscurity. If a concubine lost favor and bore no sons, she could spend decades in quiet isolation. Her courtyard would grow silent. Servants reassigned, her name fading from court discussions. When she died, a brief record might note the date, nothing more. In earlier periods, cruelty could be far more direct. Under the founder of the Ming Dynasty, the Hongwu Emperor, suspicion ran deep. Having risen from peasant origins to overthrow the Yuan dynasty, he trusted few. After his death, historical accounts suggest that dozens of his concubines were executed to accompany him in burial law. Grim echo of ancient sacrificial traditions, long thought abandoned. Official histories frame this as ritual devotion. But devotion under compulsion is not devotion. It is terror. Later Ming emperors varied in temperament. The Wanli Emperor famously withdrew from active governance for decades, isolating himself within the palace. During his long seclusion, factionalism intensified. Concubines connected to rival political groups became symbols of larger power struggles. Even childbirth could trigger court-wide tension, as factions debated succession rights between sons of different mothers. When politics enters the nursery, innocence disappears. The architecture of the inner court reinforced psychological control. High walls divided courtyards, ensuring limited contact between women of different ranks. Gates were locked at night. Guards stationed at every entrance. Even laughter could draw suspicion if overheard in the wrong context. And then there were the rules of conduct. Concubines had to kneel upon imperial summons. They could not address the emperor directly unless invited. They were forbidden from interfering in state affairs. Letters home were restricted. Travel outside the palace was virtually non-existent, except under extraordinary circumstances. Imagine entering at 15. Imagine turning 30 without ever walking beyond the same stone pathways. Imagine turning 50, watching new teenage girls arrive wide-eyed, terrified, while you sit in ceremonial robes, a relic of a reign long past. And then imagine dying in a room history will never describe. When foreign observers began documenting China more aggressively in the 19th century, they were rarely allowed inside the inner palace. The system protected itself through invisibility. Only after the fall of the Qing in 1912 did fragments surface. The last Emperor Pui later wrote memoirs describing aspects of palace life. He spoke of ritual, isolation, and the strange detachment of living as a symbol rather than a person. Though he was emperor, he too was trapped by tradition. But what of the women around him? When imperial power collapsed, many former concubines were left without income, protection, or recognition. Some quietly married, some lived in poverty. Some carried secrets they never shared. Their suffering had been normalized for centuries, erased not only by historians, but by cultural acceptance. The system endured because it was seen as natural. Heaven above, emperor below, women beneath. But beneath that hierarchy was a hidden truth. The imperial harem was less about romance and more about control of bloodlines, alliances, loyalty, and legitimacy. It was a human system built on surveillance, competition, and silence. And when systems like that operate for centuries, their victims rarely leave monuments. They leave whispers. Power can command obedience. It can command ritual. It can command history itself to rewrite the truth. But it cannot completely silence the human heart. By the late years of the Qing dynasty, the imperial system that had once seemed eternal was beginning to fracture. Foreign powers pressed at China's borders. Internal rebellions burned across provinces. Reformists challenged centuries of rigid tradition. And inside the scarlet walls of the Forbidden City, the old machinery of control began to feel fragile. For generations, concubines had survived through silence. Now, silence was becoming dangerous. The late 19th century was a period of humiliation and upheaval for China. Reformers within the court urged modernization. Among them was the young Guangxu emperor, who attempted sweeping reforms in 1898. During what became known as the 100 Days Reform, his efforts were supported quietly by Consort Zhen. Unlike many concubines, Consort Zhen was educated, politically aware, and unafraid to speak. She encouraged the emperor's reformist ideas, supported modernization, and reportedly criticized corruption within the court. That alone was dangerous. But she made a far greater mistake in the eyes of the most powerful woman in China, Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi had risen from concubine to regent decades earlier. She understood the palace better than anyone alive. She knew its alliances, its whispers, its vulnerabilities. She had survived by mastering the same system that crushed others. When Guangxu attempted to sideline her authority, Cixi acted swiftly. The reform movement was suppressed. The emperor was placed under house arrest within the palace. And Consort Zhen? When foreign armies entered Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, the imperial court prepared to flee. Consort Zhen was accused of disobedience and disruptive behavior. Before the court left, she was thrown into a well. Official records barely mention the event. A reform-minded concubine drowned. The empire moved on. But something had changed. For centuries, the suffering of concubines remained hidden because the empire was stable. Stability justified silence. Now, instability exposed it. When the Qing dynasty finally collapsed in 1912, the last emperor, Pui, was only 6 years old. Though allowed to remain in the Forbidden City for a time, the illusion of divine rule had shattered. The gates that had imprisoned thousands of women for centuries would eventually open. What emerged were fragments, memories from former eunuchs, scattered letters, whispered accounts passed down within families. Some described loneliness so profound that women spoke to birds in their courtyards just to hear a response. Others described rigid daily schedules that left no room for spontaneity. A few spoke of friendship's rare, fragile bonds. Psychologically, the toll was immense. Modern historians and psychologists analyzing palace life suggest that many concubines likely suffered from chronic depression, anxiety, and trauma. Yet at the time, their suffering was framed as duty. A virtuous woman obeyed, a virtuous woman endured. But endurance has limits. There were moments small, nearly invisible moments of resistance. Some concubines refused to compete, forming quiet sisterhoods instead of rivalries. Some deliberately avoided imperial attention to escape political danger. A few reportedly feigned illness to avoid summons. These acts were not revolutions, but in a system built on compliance, even subtle defiance mattered. The tragedy is not only what was done to them, it is that their inner lives were deemed unworthy of record. Imperial historians chronicled battles in exquisite detail. They recorded celestial omens, harvest yields, and diplomatic missions. But the emotional landscape of thousands of confined women? That was irrelevant to statecraft. Erasure was policy. Even burial reflected hierarchy. Empresses were interred with ceremony and grandeur. Lower-ranking concubines often received modest graves, sometimes relocated or lost. Archaeological excavations in the 20th century uncovered tombs with minimal inscriptions, names without stories. History had reduced them to titles: concubine, consort, lady, never fully human. Yet when we examine the structure of imperial China honestly, we see that the concubine system was not an anomaly. It was central to governance. Marriage alliances stabilized relationships. Producing multiple heirs safeguarded succession. Political factions formed around maternal lines. The inner court influenced the outer court in ways official documents tried to disguise. The harem was political infrastructure, and its human cost was enormous. Even powerful figures like Cixi reveal this paradox. She survived and dominated within the system, but she also perpetuated it. Her own rise from concubine to regent demonstrates that agency existed, but it came at a price. To survive, one often had to enforce the same structure that once threatened you. Power does not always liberate the oppressed. Sometimes it transforms them into guardians of the system. By the early 20th century, as Republican ideals spread and imperial structures collapsed, the concubine system itself began to disappear. Modern marriage laws would eventually outlaw imperial-style harems. The idea of women confined solely for dynastic reproduction grew incompatible with emerging concepts of citizenship. But disappearance does not equal acknowledgement. For decades after the fall of the dynasty, China focused on revolution, war, and modernization. The private suffering of palace women remained peripheral to national narratives. Only in recent generations have scholars revisited court records, re-examined memoirs, and analyzed archaeological findings to reconstruct a fuller picture. And what emerges is not a simple tale of cruelty. It is a complex story of power, culture, gender, survival, and silence. Not every emperor was sadistic. Not every concubine was miserable. But the system itself, built on absolute male authority and female confinement, created conditions where abuse could flourish without consequence. When we walk today through the Forbidden City, now a museum visited by millions each year, we admire its architecture, its symmetry, its golden roofs. But beneath those tiles lies another history. Invisible footsteps, unheard cries, unwritten diaries. History once presented emperors as divine. Now we understand them as human, capable of brilliance, capable of brutality. And when we re-examine what happened to their concubines, we confront a broader truth. Power often hides its ugliest acts behind ritual and tradition. The question is not whether suffering occurred. The question is why it was deemed acceptable. And perhaps even more haunting, how many other stories in other empires remain buried beneath official glory? The concubines of imperial China were not merely shadows in silk robes. They were individuals caught inside one of the most controlled environments in world history. Their names may be faint. Their graves may be modest. Their stories may have been softened or erased, but silence, once broken, echoes. And now, centuries later, we are finally listening.